welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I'm your host, Jessica, and I'm really excited to welcome back Christopher Golden. For a while, I've wanted to have you back to talk about one of your horror books. The last time you were on with the amazing Amber Benson to talk about the Buffy Audible series, which was great. But now I have you here to talk about Carry Me to My Grave. So welcome, Christopher.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me back.
So tell us a little bit about this book, which is kind of like a road trip with a body and a not so heartwarming family reunion.
Yeah, the family dynamic in this one is definitely not ideal. But yeah, so the story is about a guy named Malcolm Wise, who's it's set in 1956, and Malcolm has recently come back from serving in the Korean War. And he's living back at home with his mother and his sister-in-law. Malcolm's mom is dying, and she's basically on the way out, and she asks him to make her a promise, which is they're in Indiana, and she makes him promise that when she dies, he will bring her body back to her birthplace in Maine and bury her in the soil there in her birthplace. But it has to happen before the second sunrise after her death. And yeah, and the moment Maggie dies, that's his mother, things start to claw their way up out of the dirt around the country and make their way toward Malcolm and Maggie to try to prevent him from fulfilling his promise.
It was a absolute thrill ride of a journey in so many ways. I got like all of these like vibes from it. I had a little bit of a like From Dusk Till Dawn, just like it was, but it was also very fresh and very original. And I really felt like I was in the seat next to Malcolm and Violet with Maggie in
Yeah.
tow. Do you want to talk a little bit about where the idea for this book came from?
It's a really sometimes I have an idea that's sort of fully formed, or I back into it from the concept of what the horror is going to be, but this book is sort of the opposite of that. I was out for a walk with my wife, and it just occurred to me that, I always try to have this sort of emotional core and character-based core to the horror that I create. And in this case, I just had this idea of this, guy who is trying to bring his mother's body home to bury it, and something is trying to stop them. And that's all I had when I started. I just had this concept. Um, and as soon as I sat down to start kind of working it out, what that was, um, it became so much about the era. It's set in 1956. The characters are I watch a lot of film noir and movies from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And the characters in this book are sort of like, what if you took sort of generally two-dimensional film noir characters, which isn't an aspersion. There are film noirs that are way three-dimensional. But what if you took characters like that and tried to make them really fully fleshed out and have this sort of family dynamic? Because Malcolm's brother and sister both play into it. Their relationship with their mother plays into it heavily. Um, and then it was about just keeping the terror going, keeping the dread going, and the momentum. And I knew something was going to claw its way up out of the dirt. I didn't know initially what that something was going to be. And figuring that out was also just such a pleasure to sort of, what is this terror and what is the connection and how does it all kind of come together? So
How did you keep it going in your writing process? I mean, how long did this one take you to write to keep it so tight?
I think it probably took me about 9 months, maybe 8 months. And I talk to other writers all the time, and the two words that I keep repeating all the time when I talk about trying to write something that's a horror thriller is dread and momentum, or are dread and momentum. And and I think you have to keep both of those things going at all times. Um, and it's not that much to juggle, to be honest, right? You have to be able to really weave it together, or another metaphor I use is sort of like um, I think about like Jenga tower if you're playing Jenga, right? So the story is this tower, but sometimes, if you want to take out um I don't know, I'm not saying it correctly, but basically like, if you take out a piece that is a character piece, you need to replace it with something that's going to keep it standing, keep it moving, keep it going. And so you have this this necessity really, but I love it. I mean, that's my favorite part of writing these kinds of books is needing to keep the character stuff, the momentum, and the dread in kind of perfect balance. So,
The characters all have really interesting connections with one another. So of course you have Malcolm, and he has this connection to Violet, who's his sister-in-law. Uh, and his brother's a whole other story altogether. And then we meet his sister much later.
yeah.
Were all the characters fully formed when you came up with the idea of the family, or did they kind of come piece by piece?
So interestingly, for me at least, the wild card was Violet. And this is what is sort of my favorite thing that happens in stories like this. Um, So I knew when his brother would come into the story. I knew when his sister would come into the story. I kind of knew what their dynamic was going to be. Um, I knew that the issues of having a narcissistic mother were going to be a big part of what the story was and affecting their relationships and all of that stuff. But Violet was barely intended to be a part of the story when I first conceived it. And for sure, when I first introduced her, writing that first scene in the book, she wasn't supposed to go on the trip with him. But as soon as I started writing the character and writing them together, I was like, no, I need to have her there. I need to have that counterpoint to what's happening with him. And her perspective was going to be really important. And their relationship was going to be vital to his evolution over the course of the story.
And Maggie's backstory, you you know from the blurb, or the back, that people considered her a witch.
Right.
And I mean, y- of course, like you could look at this like, oh, okay, back in the 1950s, women being weird, people have stories about them, but like there's lore there.
Yes.
It's not just that. There's lore there. Um, how did you come to the lore? Like, did you draw on anything you'd heard? Did you draw on any personal experiences? Or did she kind of come out of the grave to you as well?
Well, Maggie, and I always try to make this really clear because if my mother were still alive, she would think Maggie was her, or that I was making, Maggie's definitely not my mother, but certainly there is a lot of inspiration there, and partly in bad ways, in the sense of she was definitely narcissistic, and um, she was a great mother when I was growing up, but the older she got, the more narcissistic she became and the more difficult she became. However, uh, I look at her as a single mother because my parents were divorced when I was quite young. And working really hard to take care of her family, and how she was viewed by other people in our world, as a hardworking single mother who wasn't really home, who was, working 70 hours a week, and my brother and I were, left to our own devices most of the time. Um, and so that idea of how other people see your parent versus how you see your parent was definitely inspired by that whole experience. Um, and I did love this idea of like, they didn't pay attention growing up to the fact that people said their mother was a witch. Like she was their mother, so it was like, these are just people shit talking her, it's just like, but of course it becomes much more complicated than that in the story. And as far as the lore is concerned in the story, I spend a lot of time thinking about a lot of my books tap into this idea that I have about the world before the world before the world. In fact, the book I'm writing right now, I keep referring to the gods before gods, the people before people, and all of that stuff. And I love to sort of tap into existing mythology or lore and say, but what about before that? Or what, how can we address that? So it's just really fun to, inspired by something, to then create your own thing.
I love it so much, and now I want to read what you're you're writing next.
Yeah.
You've completely intrigued me.
Next year.
Next year, well, we'll have to make a plan for it.
Sounds
But carry me to your grave. One thing you do obviously is you deal with the idea of laying the dead to rest and what that means. And it's really interesting, just in different traditions, what is considered laying somebody to rest. And yeah, here there is literally no rest before Maggie sees her own.
right. Yeah, I mean, I really feel like, I try to do things all the time where, when I was growing up, I watched a lot of Looney Tunes cartoons, right? And those cartoons and a lot of the Marvel comics that I read when I was a kid, if you had a certain mindset and you were a certain age, you would read it and have one experience. But if you were older and had a different mindset, you would have a completely different experience. And my hope is that some readers will read books of mine, this book in particular, and have one experience, and others uh, will focus on what I'm really talking about. And laying things to rest is what this whole book is about, right? It's about being able to finally exhale in so many ways and take a new breath, take and what it costs you and what it requires to get to that point. So yeah,
Thank you so much. Check out Carry Me to My Grave. Christopher, please come back and talk about something else next year.
I'd love to. Thank you, Jessica.
All right. This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My guest was,
Christopher Golden.
and we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.